Now I'd like to introduce Vincent Albouy. I'd like to give him the floor. He has been studying for years the honey-making bees, and he is studying the demography of the wild bees in the area of Nouvelle-Aquitaine. And his conference is the bee making honeys in the north of Nouvelle-Aquitaine. Vincent Albouy, I give you the floor. I'd like to give you a quick summary of my background. So where I'm talking about, I work not as a beekeeper, but as an entomologist, and not as a professional, but as an amateur, passionate about insects since childhood. I received training as an entomologist in the early 80s. And I did that in Paris under the leadership of Claude Cassanel. But I did not carry that training to completion for personal reason. What was intended to be my thesis became Fauna of France of Dermopteres, published in 1919, co-signed by Cassanel. Having become in 1987 director of entomology laboratory of the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, I collaborated with him, with Mr. Cassanel, in this institution, with the status of attaché until 1999, date of his death. I abandoned the Dermoptera systematic to focus since the 1990s on the protection of ordinary nature, in particular insects and gardens. For 25 years, I have written several books on this subject. My encounter with the honeybee was late. I bought 2 dead beehives when I moved in 1988 to a house. I started studying about honeybees later on. I had a house with a big plot of land in 1988 in a small village close to La Rochelle. And this was simultaneous with the arrival of the Varroa mite in the region. I didn't want to treat my beehives, and you can see one of those 2 beehives. In 1992, I placed there was a little vine beside this house that I bought in 1992. I placed these 2 empty beehives in this vine, in this plot of land, which actually to chase away the hunters' dogs. And the vine was supposed to be intended to be resting. In December of 99, we had a hurricane, which caused very significant damage in my area. In February 1990, I inspected the wood to make an inventory of what had fallen trees and so forth. And I find the forgotten beehives, and to my surprise, they were busy. So I realized that I'd placed them empty with their frames without any wax, and they had been repopulated, which meant that you could see the wax, the black wax. And I realized that after this, my reflection was, when I take care of them, they die, and when I leave them alone, they prosper. The second awareness was in 2007, when I discovered in a dump close to where I lived, and it was a sunken metal barrel with bees in it. And I was thinking, well, that is not the best kind of environment for bees for thermal reasons. It doesn't resemble a hollow tree. But I got thinking, well, if the bees are forced to live in a dump, then it means that there is a bit of a crisis or lack of lodging for them. So with the Office for Insects and Their Environment in Poitou-Charentes, we started talking, and we decided to investigate building nesting boxes. So we had to build artificial beehives, a little like what is done for birds, where you have nesting boxes set here and there to provide for them. And we have been testing this, and it's working fairly well. And the question would be, where would be the best spots to place these bee houses? So I started a bibliography to try and see and study what is written or said about these issues. And I noticed that there was virtually nothing on this subject in France and more globally in Europe in the scientific reviews, and that is since the 18th century. The only people who have conducted studies is the United States and Australia, among which the CELI study that was mentioned in prior conferences. In some cases, the environment in the US is not the same as here. I found a study of the Dr. Canteneur in 1978, who was an apicultural veterinarian on the health status of honeybee colonies in the wild in France. And ultimately, it's our only source in depth information on the subject. The Poitou-Charentes delegation of the decided in 2016, let's launch a study to remedy this lack of data. So this is what we are speaking about. We are speaking about the bee making honeys in the wild. They are not exploited. They are not, they could be indirectly exploited. Maybe people try and capture the Asian hornet and try and catch a swarm with that bait. It's an indirect exploitation. We don't speak of black bees or things like this. That's not the issue here. The issue here, do bees choose where they are going to nest or get established? So do we follow escapees who have lodged themselves by themselves in a wall or in a trunk? Or is it a swarm of bees which has been recuperated, even placed by us? This is not a wild colony because there were intervention of men. If we don't misplace this, then we do have bees. For this study, we based it on existing studies. One of the biggest is the study of Selle. In the 1970s, he studied the demography of the bees in the northeast of the United States. This study is divided in two big sections. One is an inventory of places where bees live by characterizing as closely as possible the location, the exposition. And a second part is follow through what we saw earlier with the slide of Fabrice Requier, where we could see the cavity which was occupied, etc. The protocol of Selle is fairly simple, and it provides 3 visits per year, which is our area is March, the first visit, the second after swarming, 15th of July, 15th of August, and then another one, which is done in Aria, the third just before wintering in October for us. So as soon as we hear about a colony, we record it, and most of it is destroyed colonies. Maybe people don't want the bees in their garden and they solicit us. Even if these sites can be destroyed, maybe they are recuperated. When we decided to conduct this study, we had to find the first colonies in the wild. And we followed what Selle did. The first technique was the big box, bee box, where we capture the bees in boxes with a leurre, which is a certain syrup. This goes back to antiquity, was a method already used. A second technique is using by drawing the different flight lanes on a map. It is possible to determine by triangulation a fairly small area where a colony is located. 1.80 meter height, to see the flight lanes of the different bees, and placing them on a map gives us a chance to, here you can see, this is where they have this lure, and you can see on this map the different lines, which is triangulation. And it gives us the possibility to two different things: facilitate research these colonies in the wild, and at the same time it gives us a chance to have an exhaustive map. And this is how Seeley conducted his studies in the forest of Arbois. The problem that we have is that we have more than 17,000 beehives declared in Charente-Maritime at the time of our tests, which are everywhere, even in the woods. They especially allowed us to make the cartography of apiaries. So we made an inventory of nesting sites. So we had to go out and see and interview, let's say, targeted audiences, naturalists, beekeepers, farmers, foresters, or just people out there for walks, or pruners. And then we benefit from word of mouth too. So the original honeybee nesting site, let's say in our area, in our region, are definitely the hollow trees. Here you can see an oak tree which got hit by in a storm by thunder. Most of the time when we have the leaves, so with the leaves, it's much harder to sight these things or spot the hole or just the flight of the bees. To be able to track ideally is when the bees start flying in March, and let's say mid-April. So it's a very short amount of time for us to be able to really make extended observations. But with habit, you can see here a trunk which had been inhabited by bees. They had set some propolis around it, so we could see in winter spot these interesting places, because we can see that these spots have been used, so it gives us some extra indications, nevertheless not very widespread. One of the interesting trees are the polar trees. We used to have a lot of hedges in our areas, and hedges have a lot of pollard trees. So these type of pollard trees have many more cavities, as Dr. Laurent Larieux mentioned. So we give it preference to go study those types of trees. Nevertheless, we do have some problems in the years to come. The pollard trees has been is no longer being done so much. So the majority of these trees are pollard trees, which are getting older, or many are drying. And it is, even if some, forestry, they reuse these pollard trees, but we have about 50 years during which these kind of trees will have not been produced. So to have good inventories, if we want to do them just by sight, by spotting, but with the confinement, we were restricted because we had planned an extensive inventory of these cavities, and we could have followed them through to see if the bees had been followed through, and we hadn't managed because, like I said, the confinement, and we had thought that we could use some thermal imager to follow through and spot these kind of activities. We can spot those places with thermal cameras and then see them in March. But we have a vicious kind of holes. And here you have a pollard tree, and you can see with the arrow, the red arrow. It's a small hole to start with, and it is not visible at all from the bottom of from under the tree. Sometimes maybe somebody who has a big tractor might mention to us that he spotted one of these things. So here lies the difficulty to have inventories which are extensive and who have everything. That might be partial studies because of the height, because the more the colonies will be high, the harder it will be. We have colonies which are 13 meters high, 40 meters high, and they are only discovered when the sycamore is cut down, and then at that point we will be notified that there was a colony in it. What is interesting, some people tell us about, this is a tree, an oak tree, 80 years old, which had been cut down. It's an exploited, it's a forestry. And we can see bees are still in the forest in Chizé. And when Fabrice Requier had mentioned that there was in the Chizé forest, had not ever seen wild bees in the nature. There are not that many, but regularly we can spot these things, and we can see that most probably that globally in the French forests, if we have an old enough tree to have a cavity within, bees will take advantage of this. In our area of very old monuments, churches, 12th century, we had building methods which would give opportunity for cavities in old walls, and we would have colonies. And here we have a colony in the Chateau du Douai, which is a castle built in the 17th century. Here you have another colony in the castle of Chalais in Charente. You can see it, it's indicated with a red arrow. You need binoculars to see this because it's very high most of the time. But if I can zoom in on it, we can notice that around the hole we have dark brown propolis, and with habit we can spot these cavities which have been inhabited by bees. And we can spot them in winter because even if they are inactive, you can't see the actual bees, but because of the black propolis, they can be spotted. These old buildings are very interesting. Here you have, this is the floor plan of the Abbey of La Areo. It's of the Middle Ages until 18th century, let's say. But to the right, you can see the church. The dotted areas are the ones in ruin. What is still in existence or standing, let's say, is in black. And these are very old walls and very often very thick. And you can see A, B, C, D, E, all the way to L. And there are about 14 spots of occupied at least part of the year. And these have been occupied. These colonies have been occupied. And some holes were emptied in June, were re-inhabited in September. So a very dense spot. And we are really tracing this down, and we will be following it in the coming years. But you can really see that in our area, the proportion of colonies in the wild is very important. The hives are there too, and they could escape, and then they could just inhabit these. In Poitou-Charentes, one thing can be said is we do not lack wild bees. We don't know if they are viable or not, but nevertheless, that's the things we have observed. A classic example here, where we can see that the bees are caught in between a shutter and a window. We can see them from inside the house. So it would be very interesting for us to follow, because we could be in the house, we could, without disturbing it, we could see it. Most of the time when people do mention that they have one of these, they ask us to get rid of them rather than ask us to keep it so we can observe them properly. But we do have 2 or 3 cases in the Vienna area where the people, the owners of these buildings, decide to let the bees stay there, so we can make very interesting observations. We have as well situations in the roofs. We can see the cement which is under the roof, which has been moved, and the bees have settled here. Chimneys as well. Chimneys are one of the most interesting spots for bees. We have heard many times, I've had in my chimney is occupied by bees. Not necessarily by the same colony, but clearly for these chimneys which are not in use, it is something positive of the electric heating. So the chimneys are no longer in use, and they can be recuperated by bees. But for us, it's not very convenient, because it's very hard for us to be able to access it. For one, it's very high. They can escape through the sides. So for us, it's very difficult to see if there's a pollen or not, see if it's alive or not. Here, there's a zoom again on the chimney. A picture was taken in August, and we had a heavy activity, a lot of bees. And you can see at the bottom, there is an accumulation of guardians, but you can definitely see that it's occupied. So chimneys are for sure very interesting. This was dismounted, and we had been following it for 2 years. The owner had been conducting some repairs, and you can see the black areas, and that speaks for a long occupation. It had been inhabited by a swarm, and you can see all the bee activities in it. And you can see that in the chimneys, it's a very appreciated place for the bees. The observations I've conducted is that people have not been the population has not disturbed the bees too much. In the trees, they have propolis, so trees do not take in humidity, so condensation could be as well favorable for them. These are personal reflections. Another artificial place for bees, the owl nesting boxes as well. If they have sufficient capacity, we have 3 that we've been following for the last years. There's no problem for survival in this one, whether it's vertical or horizontal type of a box. You can see that the volume each time should be about 22.5 liters. It's minimum 20 liters from what we have read in the studies of Thomas Seeley. These studies have been verified here. The minimum size should be 22.5 liters. This photo was taken in the summer. It was very hot, and you can see the huge quantity of bees right outside. We have a honeybee nesting box that we created. And this photo was taken in 2014 when we placed it. And 6 years later, this nesting box still exists, and you can still find it where we had spotted. And it is a Vare hive that we have completely closed. And the only way to open it up is unbolting the floor, the bottom part. So there's no observations, but the ones we place in the nature, the purpose is not to open them or touch them. We let them be. These types of the occupation of bees in the wild. Then we have a wide variety of artificial cavities, for example, which can be filled up top left. This is a swarm which was forgotten by its owner simply, probably 15 years old at least. This photo was taken 2 or 3 years ago, and this winter, sadly, it broke because of its age, and the colony was lost because it couldn't get out anymore. Up top, there's a hollow Christ in metal, and we have seen that oftentimes. These type of cavities, if we think about it as humans or in a rational way, those are not at all thought for bees. So in the sun, it's not thought for bees because when it's hot, you can imagine the heat inside, and the same problem, no shadow whatsoever. You could imagine the heat, and even though the bees, I discovered that in 2014, and I'm following it for the 6 years. And certain winters they have survived, but some of the winters they managed to survive. They managed to make do with high heats, and I think it's because this Christ is located in swamp area. So when it's very hot, they always have the right amount of water to cool off and to cool the cavity. At the bottom, you have a hollow utility pole, and the 6-7 meters high. And you can notice that there's a big transformer. And I've been following this same hollow utility pole since 2014, and they managed to survive through the winter. And this must be the 3rd colony since 2014. So I would be led to think that magnetic waves should not bother them, because we clearly can see that this would be a spot where they would have a lot of different waves, but clearly wouldn't disturb them. Any hollow object, here you have yeah, a barrel which has been has been occupied too. That's concerning inventory. Now we have encountered a few cases of nesting which are half in the open, in widely open wall niches, so they can survive. But I followed that particular colony, and I know several like that, which conflict, for example, with pigeons, which like these type of spaces. And we have as well some colonies just out in the open, just nesting out in the noved on a pear tree in the middle of a field. I've never seen a colony which has survived a winter outside. It's not so much the rain or the cold. Charente-Maritime is close to the sea, so we have a lot of wind. And most often it's the wind, which is which will prevent the nesting in open air. That is concerning inventory, which concerns the whole of France. I've shown you especially Charente-Maritime, but we have information about this area in particular, but we have some as well from northern Aquitaine. So there's a monitoring of these different colonies. On this particular map, you have, this is northern Aquitaine. In red, you can see that you have vineyards, Cognac and Bordelais. Yellow could be wheat or sunflowers too. Green, it's breeding or bocage. In brown, this is where you would find wood. So sector 1 is the historic site where we started our studies in 2016, and we had a demographic monitoring after that. So then this was in the area, let's say, of vineyards or agriculture. So this sector is managed. And then sector 2, it's in the north of the Vienna. You can see it on the map in the middle. These are people who are passionate about insects, which have joined us. And the association is called Les Veilleurs d'Abeilles, the bee watchers. It's an association. In sector 1 in 2018, 209, we have followed 109 different sites. And since 2020, we have about 100. Since 2020, the sector 2, they have again 100 and more than 100. So it's on the yellow area, but majority is in the east of the zone, which is the zone which is more breeding, bocage, lots of hollow trees, very interesting. The number of colonies in hollow wood is much higher than in my area. Sector 2, the particularities of this is a science, let's say it's voluntary people who help. In sector 1, I do everything, let's say, or supervise everything. In the second sector, you have several zones which each have a different person in charge, and there's a big effort in the inventory as well, implicating local people. So coordinating with a structure of education of the environment, which is a center, has been created. So these things can be studied. So they have even provided for one part-time employee. So it's very interesting. He works for us, and it is people gathered around this part-time employee gathering information. So in sector 25, we only have 25 sites. It's 2 people named Adam Wright and Karen Massen. And they have an activity where they build hives which are round or oval, and they have an activity of beekeepers, which are natural beekeepers, let's say. So the 25 sites that they follow in that sector, more than half are these kind of hives. If not, the rest are colonies, which this sector is very wide. It's as big, let's see, as far as hectares is just about the same as sector 2. So these sites enable us to progress. In 2018, 2019, we noticed that the protocol we were following of Thomas Seeley was not strict enough to be implemented here in this area of France. When he published his studies in 78, the colony which was live in March would mean it would be the same if they discovered it in April. We noticed, on the other hand, in our situation, in our area, that colonies would be spotted in March and would die end of April, or let's say beginning of May, and then a new colony would come. So in July, it wouldn't be the same colony, but in the protocol of Seeley would have been the same colony, which in our area wasn't verified. So for us, it was just hoarding the study. So we decided when the 2 other groups joined us to follow a protocol which would be a little stricter, where we had to visit every month the colonies which had survived in March. So we could have a bit finer study, but less big. The problem was that the 17th of March, 2020, we had the confinement as well. Yeah, at 17th of March, we couldn't follow through because of confinement. So we had to come back to the protocol of Seeley we had started with. And since the confinement seems like it's going to be probably still extensive in 2021, we have decided to put together an alternate way of doing things. So we will continue with 3 visits per year, but starting in, but each person who's in charge of these areas, we have selected close spots close to our confinement, or we could go, let's say, to a doctor and at the same time go spot a certain area to go see every week if there has been mortalities in the spring. Even the empty spots will be visited. The thing is to define the swarming time. There's a lot of beekeeping in our areas, especially in a sector 1, And starting already end of March, it's for sure end of March, we have hives which are artificially nourished, so or fed. So this, so start the beginning of April, we would like to have a calendar which is much more precise. But the calendar of Sile would say that only starting in May there would be big swarmings. But we have different data here in our area. What Sile discovered in northeast United States in the 1970s. So we will be able to have a better follow through of these different sites. So here we have 2018, 2019 on the first sector. We have different numbers here that I have regrouped. Table 1. So we had 71 in December 2017, then 76 in 2018. So from 64 had fallen to 28, the occupied sites, because the swarms mentioned were swarms mentioned in the autumn, the fall. So from 69, since March was not that good, we had checked again. It was cold. We checked again in April, and we already went from 28 to 21, 7 colonies who died. So it's not something, small. But then in August 2018, we see 94, which then climbed to 109 because we had information from people who notified of other areas. But starting in October 2018, we went back down to 76. And this is a lot to do with the Asian hornet. So you can see ups and downs and ups and downs. And again in August, 68, and then again October, back down to 60. So as you can see on this chart, it's not the same patterns as in Chile in northeastern America. 22% of trees, 40% inhabitants in walls. So really 2/3 of the basically old castles, and as well mostly churches, old churches, which have the advantage of being not private, so we can access them easily to make our observations without too many problems. Roofs, chimneys, we do have 5 nesting boxes, the same as the ones I showed by photo. We had 3 colonies in those utility pole or statues as well. And then 2 beehives, the one which had fallen that I showed on the photo as well. So CLAB mentions the different qualifications, which were the undetermined, that of founded, fondatrice on the chart, which would be a swarm of the year, and the one established, établi. So in December 2017, indetermined, we had 46, the ones we had discovered throughout the year. The founding ones were the ones which were empty in the winter, and the established ones had spent the previous winter. So March 2018, the 46 undetermined came back down to 18. And in April, only 14. The founding ones went down to 6 and 4 and established 7 to 4. And you can see clearly on this particular period, a little more survival rate in the established than the fondatrice. But in the SILE studies, the established colonies were much higher than the founding ones. All the undetermined of March and April became some established. So in August, we have 21 indetermined. So we discovered some new sites in August 2018, so we could add them to the chart. And then 40 founding, we were starting from nothing. So 40 swarms, so founding and established became established ones, so 33. October, you can see undetermined went from 21 to 17, the founding one from 40 to 33, about the same proportion, and they established from 33 to 26. Maybe the same proportion, maybe a little more. March 2019, undetermined goes from 17 to 7, and then to 13 on the founding ones, and established 8. So we can't see any difference between the founding ones and the established, which are not similar traits as the study of Seeley. So in 2019, so since the founding rise up to 48, the 13 of March refer to the ones of the year before. So 48 swarms. So we can see that there was a huge colonization, what had survived. And in autumn, we can see we went from 48 to 42, a survival rate in the autumn, which is stable. The table 4 is the rate of loss according to environment. But we can see here there's a better survival rate, 74, 20, 28. The better survival rate percentage-wise, you can see. So you can see all these different numbers, which leads us to think that there's a better survival rates in the area where the wooded area, which is not a surprise. But the number of sites, 23 is still pretty low. In 2020, the numbers are not yet sealed. We have to look at all of that. But we have changed our classification for breeding. And we have spread the things a little differently. Nevertheless, in the second sector, in wooded areas and breeding areas, we would have significantly higher rates of survival. So if we have to summarize all this, there's a lot of colonies in the wild in our area. Certainly, quite a few come from the beekeepers, the managed beekeeping, apiaries, the zones of big culture, grande culture. They probably, the bees in that area come from regular beehives, but where we should protect, we should have measures to protect the environment in the bocage areas where there's a lot of hollow trees, which give a chance for cavities to be created. And we have fields with flowers where the bees can get fed, that you don't necessarily will have if it's just forest areas. All these things are hypotheses. This will all have to be verified as we study further. Our goal is to reach 2024, 2025, and this is very interesting, and the adventure goes on, even if the confinement makes things complicated for us. But we hope to know the bees of our areas always more, so we can protect them in a more efficient way. Thank you, Vincent. It's very interesting. I had my alarm clock, so I was monitoring everything. We will be getting information from you concerning your further studies, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. We see many commentaries from different people,